Network Security and Penetration Testing, chapter number 11, and in this chapter we are going to talk about denial of service attacks. We'll define what is a denial of service attack, then we'll describe the causes of DDoS attacks and describe several varieties of DDoS attacks. Now we'll have to define the distributed denial of service, because whenever it's coming from a group of computers which are instructed to launch an attack simultaneously at the same time, we call it distributed denial of service. Then we'll discuss some DOS and DDoS attacks and describe the ways to prevent the DDoS attacks by the end of the chapter. Now there are different causes of denial of service attacks, some major network defects and vulnerabilities. If you have not tested your network for any known vulnerabilities, you are most likely to have the denial of service attack. Now there are lots of tools available on the internet with the help of which you can check the overall strength and the basic security architecture of your network by running those tools. It would tell you that these are the things which are open on your network, and it's highly likely that you would come under a denial of service attack. Now, first of all, the network architecture, vulnerability of a specific server or the system architecture. Now, if we'll talk about the network architecture, there could be lots of reasons. There could be VLANs which are viewable by the other VLANs. Maybe the people connected on one VLAN can search the people on the others. Maybe there are no access control lists and so on. Now, on a specific system or architecture means that how powerful is the system to cater how many requests per second. Defects and bugs in the operating system or the software, whether the operating system has been patched properly with the latest patches or not. Now, there are holes present within the system security as well, how you have defined the security parameters in your organization. Now, sometimes the defects and bugs in the operating system or the system architecture could be the firmware update which was released for a specific hardware and it has not been applied. So, the hackers can take the advantage of the vulnerabilities of the firmware and can target the systems. Some vulnerabilities cannot be closed by patching because there is an inherent bandwidth limit, that particular operating system or that hardware cannot cater more than a specific number of requests per second. For example, if you are using an older operating system which was limited to serve a limited number of requests, that's a bottleneck for your system, regardless how much bandwidth do you have. Now, if for example, if you had a bandwidth problem or a limitation of the bandwidth, you can increase the internet speed and you can cater more requests. But in the meantime, you'll have to check if your servers are capable to cater that number of requests or not. Sometimes it's limited by choice, sometimes it's limited by the hardware compatibility. Now, the causes of DDoS attacks continues. They are just talking about different kind of internet bandwidth connections and the service type plus the bandwidth which is there. Just for the sake of information, that ISDN comes in two different variants where its speed starts from 128 kbps to almost 2 mbps, and then DSL starting from 640 to 128 kbps or going up to 19 MB as well, 19 to 51 MB. Then T1 carrier, we didn't see it in the Middle East. It's 1.5 MB to 44 MB, and the optical carrier is going up to 40 GB per second. So these are different kind of connection types. Now, when we talk about types of DDoS attacks, we have x-axis, y-axis, and z-axis. X-axis is a flood attacks or the software attacks. Y-axis are isolated attacks or distributed attacks. So distributed denial of service falls in the category of Y attacks. Now, Z attacks are the voluntary or involuntary on the part of the system administrator, which it would be checking for any sort of known vulnerabilities in the system. So just keep in mind that x-axis is flood attacks or software attacks, Y-axis is isolated attacks, or we call it the distributed denial of service attacks, and Z attacks are the ones which are conducted by the administrators. Now, some attacks can be preventable by for denial of service, some are non-preventable. Preventable attacks are, it's an attack that may occur when a system administrator has designed a network or application level system to perform a variety of functions, because he is defining it himself that if it crosses the limit, stop the services. A typical example is that if you are defining a telephone system, IP telephone system, that it should not process a limited number of telephone calls within an hour, or the video conferencing calls, because it consumes bandwidth. If it exceeds that, the system stops working. So that's preventable because he defined it himself that it should not exceed this limit. Just like in the previous lab, the video of it is available on the channel for the penetrating on MySQL server from Kali Linux in order to crack the password of it. If we tried to log in a number of times from Kali Linux to MySQL, MySQL had your IP address and it put you in the quarantine so that you cannot try multiple times on your MySQL server because of the limit, which is simultaneous connections. If you limit it by the number of times you'll try on a specific target machine, you'll not be in the blacklist. And that's how they use it in order to target the systems. Then there are certain changes. The information is available in the document. You'll have to pass in some commands on SQL Server to release yourself from the quarantine, and then you'll see you'll be able to crack the password. Now, non-preventable DOS attacks is an attack in which the system administrator could not have been expected or anticipated or have prepared for. So it wasn't in their mind that any kind of attack similar to this one would come. For that, they have no option. For example, any kind of known vulnerabilities or recently identified vulnerabilities. If there has been a new breach in the operating system release of Microsoft, of server operating system or the Windows operating system, and if the patches are not applied on time, there are high chances that the people who are looking for those kind of vulnerabilities on the system would find those vulnerabilities and attack the networks which are having those operating systems which are not patched. Just like Microsoft announced that Windows 7 is end of life, end of service, similarly Windows Server 2003 is end of life, end of service. So if these kind of operating systems are still there in your organization, then there are high chances that anyone who is interested in penetrating on the networks would identify that you are using these operating systems, or your systems are not patched, they might penetrate in the system. So that's why it's always recommended to adapt the latest working operating systems for which there is support available and for which Microsoft is still releasing these security patches. Now, flood attacks consume the limited resources of a computer or a network by transmitting a large number of packets as quickly as possible. The flood attacks can occur under the following conditions: sending connection request, consuming the bandwidth, using your own resources, or consuming other resources. Now, any kind of attack which would consume the complete resources of a system could be a flood attack. For example, if you have printers on the network and all of a sudden people started complaining that we are not able to print from a specific printer, if you'll check it, you'll find out that there are hundreds of print requests from a system of a person who's on vacation for more than a month. So who sent all those requests? Deliberately, these kind of messages are sent or print commands are sent from the compromised systems, which would fill the memory of the printer, remote printer on which you want to print. Thus, it's locking the access to other printers in order to perform the tasks. Now the other guys will not be able to perform the operations unless the queue is cleared before they can perform the operations, and then the team would have to investigate that who's using his computer in his absence and sending all those kind of requests. Now consuming the bandwidth could be using the ping of death or unnecessary ping attacks, etc. They can also consume the resources of the system, thus the system stops performing. Now sending connection request, target or victim receives a large quantity of connection requests. Attacker is probably using a spoofed IP address. Just like we talked about earlier in our previous lecture, IP packet spoofing, where they'll modify the IP packets and would be sending it to unknown destinations, and the computer would be busy in finding the destination, thus the system would be overwhelmed with the resources. Attacker is probably using a spoofed IP address which you cannot find, and in our previous lecture we discussed about the strategy that usually they adopt is they sit behind multiple proxies so that their actual IP address is not exposed. All of a network available bandwidth is consumed by sending a large number of packets. Now as you can see in this one that there is a hacker and there is a web server. So the hacker is sending lots of requests pointing towards Bob and Alice and going here and there. So lots of requests are there regardless where he want to send the packets. Using your own resources, hacker uses a forged UDP packets to connect to the echo service on one computer. Now echo service is a service which is used for diagnostics and troubleshooting, etc. It means that all the packets which are sent are received. So they are constantly sent and received back on the same machine or different machines in order to check the connectivity, the response time and time to live, etc. To a service on another computer, response from the packets will automatically be sent to a computer whose IP address the hacker is using. So the hacker would be receiving the information and the other computer would be busy in getting the responses as the hacker is sending packets to Bob, and Bob is then forwarding it to Alice, and Alice would be busy in serving all those packets which are not meant for her actually. Now consuming other resources, hacker may be able to consume the data structures, simply writing programs or script that replicates itself. Said he'll gain access to one computer, then he'll plant a script on the computer which would execute, and if other computers are connected to it using the network share, or if someone is copying the data from that computer from the USB, it would be automatically copied to that. Now it happened, and we have seen in a number of cases where such kind of code is replicated itself on the network and the resources. Or what they do is that they'll find typically the Word files, Excel files or PowerPoint files, and it would change the extension of all of those documents. Hackers also attempt to consume the disk space by using a feature that allows the data to be written to a system hard disk. It would keep on downloading unnecessary data from the internet, and it would be dumping it on the hard drive just to fill the hard disk. Now some people have the habit of saving everything in the C drive, not on the desktop but in the C drive. The others save everything on the desktop. Now after the release of the latest operating system from Microsoft, now you cannot save directly on the C drive. It prevents you from saving the documents on the C drive because of the known vulnerabilities, but still they end up saving everything on the desktop, and once your hard drive is filled, you cannot perform any operations or the computer would go too slow. Hacker also attempt to consume the disk space by using any feature that allows data to be written to the system disk. Hackers may be able to lock an account by executing a certain number of failed attempts to log in. Just like the user accounts on the Active Directory, there is a limit that if someone is trying it for a number of times, the account would be locked out. Now there are lots of reasons for that, but these reasons or policies are being exploited by these hackers because they want you to stop working, or they want to create a problems on the network where someone is trying to perform the operations, but they'll find out that the account is constantly being locked out. Now, first of all, the feature is there to safeguard that no one is trying to attempt different passwords on your account in order to gain access, so that if someone is using a dictionary attack or a brute force attack, it would be denied if he'll try it 3 or 4 times. The account goes in the lock mode for approximately 5 to 10 minutes, depending on the policy settings that you have, and then the account would be unlocked automatically. So these options are there to safeguard the overall dictionary attacks or password attacks, but they are being exploited in a different way where accounts are constantly being locked out. Now, software attacks are exploiting the existing software weakness. If there is a software which an organization is using, for example, an ERP or HR software, and they are heavily dependent on it, but the organization has not upgraded it. Reason could be that the system was working perfectly fine, but it's working on Windows XP. Now, anyone who is in search of these kind of software which are still being used in the organizations, they can target the systems because, first of all, they are not on the latest operating system. Second thing is they are not properly patched. Still, they are using the older operating systems. So they take advantage of it, of the software weakness, and then they try to attack these systems. Now, how do they get this information? Maybe a word of mouth, like if any of their friends is working in that organization and they are discussing that we are using such and such software. Second thing is that the people from that organization, if they are posting their information from social media platforms or on LinkedIn, where they can find their profiles. People are writing that we are working on these systems, and I have experience running this application, and they find out that the application which is being used in the organization is quite outdated. Now, it's very easy to fake around that I'm from a recruitment company. You'll send a message to that person that we are interested in people who are working on this software. So can you please give us details that which versions have you worked on? So the person would automatically respond that I have worked on versions this, and currently we are using this version, and this information is more than enough for them to launch any kind of attacks. Effect is either degraded performance or crashes on the victim's server. So the server might go slow or it would stop responding completely. Hackers generate a small number of carefully malformed packets to exploit known software bugs, and bugs allow hackers to change or damage the configuration files. In some softwares, if you only change the INI file of the software or the normal configuration file or the changes in the licensing file, the software stops working. And they are very smart to know that what are the known weaknesses of the system. Now, software attacks, again, ping of death, a historical DOS attack in which the hacker uses the ping utility to acquire access to the system, because they check by sending ping requests that if the remote computer is up and if it's working without having any issues, and if it's reachable, then they'll try to penetrate on the systems by sending ping packets which are larger than 64 KB to the target system. Target systems can crash or restart. Most legitimate ping utility do not allow you to send the ping request for 64 KBs. Now, you'll have to use the third-party softwares in order to craft packets which are bigger than 64 KB. Then they are telling you about some softwares. You can use AppSend to send oversized packets, and of course you can use Kali Linux, which comes in bundled with lots of utilities which can perform these operations. But of course those utilities are there for the security and vulnerability assessment on your own network. You can block pings on your firewall. Almost all operating systems have been patched to deflect this attack. So if we want, we can cancel it on the network that no one would be able to send ping to the other computers. Now, it has advantages and disadvantages for the network security and for the network security guys who want to check the connectivity on the computers they won't be able to get the actual picture that what's going on. So what we do is that on firewall, we allow it on specific computers through which they can check, and they can verify the connectivity. For rest of the users, the ping is usually blocked. DNS Service Attack, which is a domain name service database that maps the domain names to IP addresses, and two kinds of attacks are related to the DNS service, for example, DNS spoofing and DNS overflow. Now, DNS Service Attack is DNS spoofing and then overflow. So, spoofing is users or customers may be redirected to websites other than the intended destination. Because the DNS has been spoofed, if you are trying to go to Google, it would change the entry for Google to a lookalike website like a Google, and you will end up visiting a website redirected by your DNS to a fake website rather than a Google actual website. Should not be confused with phishing, may lead to customers giving their account information to the hackers, because once you are there, you'll click to log into Gmail. Once you'll enter the username and password, they'll capture it and then they'll take benefit of it. DNS overflows may happen when there is a feature to check and verify the length of the host name, and could be used to gain super user access to the system. As you can see that the request went to Bell South domain, and from the DNS cache it went to the customer and they had the request. Now, if for example someone is trying to communicate to a PayPal website, the DNS is compromised, so the request goes from there directly to the hacker computer. The hacker computer would craft a packet and would appear as a PayPal website that your request has been processed. They'll capture the credit card details and then it would send to the other computer. That's how they gain access to your financial transactions. Now we have isolated attacks come from a single source. It's easily counted by blocking the traffic from that source, because if the attack is coming from one computer specifically, you can easily know the reason of it. There are multiple ways to troubleshoot it. First of all, you can block it on the network. The second thing is you can investigate it. If you cleared it and again if the attack is coming, you can permanently ban the MAC address of the computer if it's a network computer and coming from a LAN connection. So you can block the MAC address so that the computer is completely isolated and it cannot come on the network unless and until you will thoroughly clean it or maybe format the computer. Now, the distributed attacks comes from multiple concurrent sources, much more difficult to block with access control list or firewalls, because they are distributed, they are replicating themselves on the network, and they are coming from all different directions. It depends on the hacker ability to compromise information on a large number of systems, may require hundreds and thousands of compromised hosts in a DDoS attack to be successful, and special tools are used in order to attack. As you can see, the hacker is sitting at the end. They have its handlers and the agents which are replicating it to reach a specific target. Now, the process of DDoS is fully automated. The DDoS attack occurs in the sequence where hacker identifies vulnerable host, for example, in an organization where they are imaging the systems and deploying the same image to all systems. Now, if they made a mistake in creating the initial image of the computer, the same vulnerability or the problem is being replicated to all computers on the network. Hacker gets access to those hosts. After they are compromised, hacker install the tool they need to attack each host, and hacker uses the compromised host to take advantage of the feature and target others. That's it for today's lecture. We'll stop it over here.